The Holy Gospel according to Mark, the 13th chapter. As Jesus came out of the temple, one of his disciples said to him, "Look, teacher, what large stones and what large buildings." Then Jesus asked him, "Do you see these great buildings? Not one stone will be left here upon another. All will be thrown down." When he was sitting on the Mount of Olives opposite the temple, Peter, James, John, and Andrew asked him privately, "Tell us, when will this be, and what will be the sign that all these things are about to be accomplished?" Then Jesus began to say to them, "Beware that no one leads you astray. Many will come in my name and say, 'I am he,' and they will lead many astray. When you hear of wars and rumors of wars, do not be alarmed, for this must take place, but the end is still to come. For nation will rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom. There will be earthquakes in various places. There will be famines. This is but the beginning of the birth pangs." This is the gospel of the Lord. Please be seated. Do you know what you were doing on May 22nd, 2011? Nope. Me neither. Yet I can promise that for all of us who are at least 7.5 years old or older, one thing we were doing is that we were, living. And that fact came much to the chagrin of Harold Camping. Harold Camping, you see, was a Christian radio host who had predicted that the world was going to end on May 21st, 2011. And as your ongoing earthly existence on May 22nd showed, he was wrong. And Camping was just the latest in a long line of people who have claimed to know when the end was coming. And in the hands of people like him, texts like the one we just heard from Mark 13, they seem to give credence to all sorts of end times predictions. We just heard Jesus talking about the Jerusalem temple being destroyed, about wars and rumors of wars, about nations waging battle, about earthquakes and famines. It all sounds quite terrifying. Yet if we take a deep breath, step back, and pay attention, we'll see Jesus' words in a completely different light. Now, to begin, it's crucial for us to know that this reading from Mark today is a piece of apocalyptic literature. And that is the most misunderstood literary genre contained within the Bible. Science fiction movies. Just imagine explaining those to the 12 disciples in Jesus' day. In fact, explain to me the Star Wars prequels. I still don't get the midichlorians and that stuff yet. So just like you'd be trying to explain science fiction to them, it's like us trying to understand apocalyptic literature. It's really hard for us to understand. See, first off, what we need to know is this. Apocalypse does not mean that everything is going to get blown to smithereens. Apocalyptic works were written to give suffering people hope in the present because of a promise in the future. The goal of apocalyptic works were not to predict the future, but to make sense of the present. And a brief look at Jesus' words actually bears this out. Wars and rumors of wars, false prophets and false messiahs, earthquakes, famines, and so forth. Those aren't exactly bold predictions. All these things were going on long before Jesus' day. They were happening in Jesus' day, and they continue to happen today. And the reality is that people suffer because of these things. Now, perhaps a helpful way to think about Jesus' words today, to give them a context, is to talk about God's plan and what that means. Now, as people of faith, we trust that there is an ultimate purpose, that things are not just going toward an empty or meaningless future. We trust that God is up to something good, and that God does indeed have purposes and plans for us and for the world around us. The hard part, though, is to talk about what God's plan looks like or what it means that God has a plan. Many people, whether it's spoken aloud or not, believe that God has absolutely everything all plotted out and that somehow everything that happens is a part of God's plan or is God's will. While on the surface that may seem comforting, this idea that God is in full control, there's an unsettling assumption about God that lurks behind this idea, because what does it say about God when we pay attention to the bad stuff? So the clearest and best alternative to this view of God's plan or God's will that I've ever heard comes from William Sloane Coffin in his sermon called "My Son Beat Me to the Grave," which he preached after his 24-year-old son Alexander died in a car accident. He said this: "Many things can be said when a person dies, but there's at least one thing that should never be said. The night after Alex died, I was sitting in the living room of my sister's house outside Boston when the front door opened and in came a nice-looking middle-aged woman carrying about 18 quiches. When she saw me, she shook her head, then headed for the kitchen, saying sadly over her shoulder, 'I just don't understand the will of God.' Instantly, I was up and in hot pursuit. 'I'll say you don't,' I said. 'Do you think it was the will of God that Alex never fixed that lousy windshield wiper of his? That he was probably driving too fast in such a storm? That he probably had had a couple of drinks too many? Do you think it's God's will that there are no streetlights along that stretch of road and no guardrail separating the road and Boston Harbor?'" And William Sloane Coffin continues, "Nothing so infuriates me as the incapacity of seemingly intelligent people to get it through their heads that God doesn't go around this world with his finger on triggers, his fist around knives, his hands on steering wheels. God is against all unnatural deaths, and Christ spent an inordinate amount of time delivering people from paralysis, mental illness, leprosy, and muteness." So it is not the will of God to orchestrate tragedies or cause catastrophes. Instead, God's heart is the first to break when tragedy strikes or when catastrophes happen. And let me be clear, I believe that God has a plan, but I think maybe we need a little different way to think about God's plan. I think oftentimes God's plan is envisioned much like a march, where every note is predetermined and must be played in lockstep in order for things to happen. If you watch a marching band, you will see a synchronized and meticulously plotted performance. Now that works for a marching band, but it's not how God's plan works. Instead, I think it's more helpful to envision God's plan as a piece of jazz, where the chord progressions and the melody of the song are defined, yet there's space within the music. There's room for improvisation. There's room for freedom and creativity among the musicians as the group works together, or not. Yet along the way in the piece, there may be some missed notes in other places where the music, the melody goes astray or gets lost. But there's also room for new creativity and for amazing solos that could emerge. The musicians, you and I, we have freedom and choice as we play within the structure of the song. So don't think of God as a drum major. Think of God as a jazz director. So with this in mind then, I propose that we hear Jesus' words in Mark 13, verse 7 in a new way. In this verse, Jesus says, "When you hear of wars and rumors of wars, do not be alarmed. This must take place. The end is still to come." So two things. First, although Jesus says these things must take place, he does not say that they must occur because God wants them to. Instead, wars and violence happen because that is the route humanity has chosen to take time and again. Humankind has given in to these temptations. Violence is not God's will. These are missed notes in this jazz piece where humanity has decided that war and violence are the answer, that they must happen. So really, Jesus is just being a realist here. And second, obsessing about so-called end times predictions can cloud our understanding of Jesus' words when he says the end is still to come. Now, typically, the end is thought of as a time or a place. That is, the end will happen at this particular time or in that particular place. But what if the end is not a time or a place? And what if we listen to the Bible for some direction about this? See, in Revelation 1, verse 8, Jesus declares, "I am the Alpha and the Omega." That is, Jesus Christ is the beginning and the end. So the Bible seems to say that the end is not a time or a place, but a person. The end is the person of Jesus Christ. You see, in Mark's gospel, from the reading we just heard today, Jesus is just about to be betrayed and crucified. And when the world nails God to a cross, there is no greater tragedy. Now, I don't want to give away the ending, though, so consider this your spoiler alert. Death doesn't get the last word. Death is not the end. You see, Jesus is willing to suffer through the worst the world can offer and still rise triumphant, drawing us to him. You see, the end, the Omega, Jesus Christ, is here. And rather than worrying about this, we can cling to the cross of Christ and embrace the possibilities and potential God, the great jazz director, has given each and every one of us. Now, you may know that Stan Lee died this past week. He was the creative force behind Marvel Comics and such famous characters as Spider-Man and the Fantastic Four, Iron Man, Thor, the X-Men, and on and on. And one thing that he said about the creation of the X-Men really struck me. He said this: "In X-Men, I guess my intention was to show that the world never fully tolerates people who are different. So Stan Lee created these heroes who were flawed and different." And that goes for us as followers of Jesus Christ, too. Because we know that we are flawed. We are not perfect. And we understand that being different, for example, maybe walking out of step with the war-waging world around us, well, that may not be tolerated. But we embrace this difference and we follow Jesus, not because it suddenly makes the world a safe place, but because in the cross of Christ we have the clearest picture of God's love triumphing over calamity and catastrophe. In fact, through the cross, God gives you the greatest superpower of all, the saving love of Jesus Christ. And to use Stan Lee's words in Spider-Man's story, with great power comes great responsibility. So in giving us this superpower, God's plan is for us to make beautiful music for the sake of the world God so loves. And we do this because the end is already here. Amen.